Good morning and welcome to the Forum at St. Bart's. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here. This morning we begin a series called What Comes Next? Considering the Future. And today we'll consider the future of the church with the Reverend Keith Anderson, who is the pastor at Upper Dublin Lutheran Church in Ambler, Pennsylvania, and the author of the Digital Cathedral Networked Ministry in a Wireless World. He's also the Associate for Digital Content for Lifelong Learning at Virginia Theological Seminary. He'll be joined in conversation today with our very own Patrick Hornbeck, professor of theology at Fordham University, who led a class based on Pastor Anderson's book this summer. We're very glad to have them both in conversation today. Because of Pastor Anderson's schedule, we did have to pre-record this conversation, so we will not have the opportunity to include audience questions. However, Professor Hornbeck did reach out to class members of the summer class he taught, and will be incorporating some of their questions into the discussion today. So without further ado, over to you, Patrick.
Peter, thank you so much. And Keith, welcome to St. Bart's. Thanks for taking the time to join us this morning.
Oh, thanks. It's great to be here. Great to be with you.
So,
and I'm sorry I can't be here live, but of course I have a Sunday morning gig too.
Well, and I think that's actually a perfect starting point for the conversation that we want to have. Just to provide some background for those who are listening to this forum but didn't have the chance to be part of the book discussion group. Over the summer, about 30 to 35 of us at St. Bart's got together and talked about Keith's book, The Digital Cathedral, which came out about 5 years ago. And what I found fascinating about the book, Keith, is that you situate it at the intersection of two dynamics that all of us who think about religion really had in mind in 2015. The so-called rise of the nones, the increasing numbers of people in this country and in many other countries who don't affiliate with religion, and the emergence of social media in new and exciting ways, and also some probably less exciting ways. But by the time we came to read it in 2020, of course, there's a third dynamic that came into play, which was the COVID-19 pandemic and the ways in which it, on the one hand, deprived communities of faith from being able to gather together in person for a very, very long time, and highlighted the need for other modes of connection. So we ended up talking together about the ways in which all three of these dynamics have shaped our life at St. Bart's, and I'm sure your congregation and so many congregations. So yeah. Some of the folks who are here this morning didn't get the chance to be part of that group and hear about your book. So I'd love if you just start by saying a few words about why you wrote the book and how well you think it's aged.
Sure. Well, I wrote the book. Well, let me say, I've been thinking about digital ministry for maybe about the last 10 years. And I'm just a parish pastor, full-time parish pastor, and I do a little work at Virginia Seminary. So a lot of the reflections and questions really came out of my own experience. I was pastoring a Lutheran church in Massachusetts outside of Boston, where the trends around nuns and duns is in some cases more advanced than other parts of the country. So kind of experiencing that, what does it mean to be Christian? What does it mean to be Lutheran? What does it mean to be the church in that time? And then also as these digital tools were emerging, thinking, how could we use, now it seems very primitive, but how could we use Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, and what are they and what do they do? And just trying things on to see if it would work. Podcasting sermons was kind of a new idea at that point, and seeing the ways that it could connect us together as a church community, but then also with our larger community, and kind of a light bulb went off. So Digital Cathedral came after that, after I co-authored the book Click to Save with Elizabeth Drescher. And for me, I think the Digital Cathedral, looking back, was a way of connecting the dots of my ministry through, I was doing a lot of things by instinct and kind of reacting to what I was seeing around me, and then doing kind of the research and talking to other ministry leaders to try to understand the why and the what in addition to the how.
Well, you do a really remarkable job, I thought, and so many of our class members thought, in laying out in the book these stories, these really relatable stories of creative things that many congregations around the country are doing. So let me start close to home for you. In your congregation, what have these 6 months been like since the COVID pandemic came to the East Coast?
Like everybody, very challenging. I feel like maybe only in the last month that we've really gotten our feet underneath us. like so many people, we had to jump on to figuring out online worship, in a matter of days, and figure out what that looks like and how to keep that going, and how to use email and YouTube and Facebook and whatever means we could to be communicating with folks. So now I think we're looking at hybrid confirmation classes now, and gathering outside, and we can't do a men's retreat 3-day weekend in the mountains anymore. So we're doing an evening campfire here at church, just trying to find different ways, all of which have had to have some kind of digital component to it. Our women's 1-day retreat is now 3 Saturday mornings on Zoom. So we're just kind of figuring it out on the fly, making do, as they say. Building the plane while you're flying it is really what it feels like oftentimes. And I'm learning to embrace it.
Well, and it must be wonderful for your congregation, because their pastor has literally written the book on how to do this. What's been surprising to you? So you've spent the last 5+ years thinking about these kinds of questions, and now that they've hit home in the form of the pandemic, what has reinforced your thinking from the book, and what's really surprised you or changed your thinking from the book?
I think one of the funny things about it is I try to not have my writing or speaking kind of bleed over into my pastoring. That's my primary call, and that's what I do. And I love to do the other thing and support ministry leaders. So a lot of the things that I know how to do or have written about, my congregation is kind of aware of, but not really aware of. And then when all this hit and we were kind of rolling out all of these ideas and these tools, it was like, oh, right, you're the person that does these things and can help us. So a lot of comments from the congregation about, like, thank goodness you're here, and this is just the right time. God's put you here in this place for this time, to help guide us through with all of this. So the timing, it was good. I think a lot of, it's funny, 5 years later, a 5-year-old book is usually collecting dust, or it's on the remainder shelf somewhere. And I've had a number of people approach me about the book since COVID happened, because we've all been forced to become digital ministers in one way or another. And I think a lot of it does hold up. I mean, I had a friend that said, Digital Cathedral, because we couldn't do the in-person. I said, well, there were always supposed to be bars and coffee shops, and I wasn't saying like just go online with church. That was never the image or the vision for it. We were supposed to have these other places to gather in person too. But in lieu of being able to do that, we have tried to all create, in some ways, these holy, sacred digital gathering spaces for our people.
That's wonderful. And I want to come back to that. And so just to set up a question for later on, I'm fascinated to hear your take eventually on what of these things that we've all cobbled together in the last 6 months will become part of the permanent landscape of ministry. But I wanted, if you don't mind, I want to just ask a couple of questions about concepts and ideas from the book that members of our discussion group found really provocative. So one of the things that you talk a lot about in the book is the shift from what you call from Newton to networks, that there's a set of models of sacred space, there's a set of models for how ministry leaders relate to members of congregations, and fundamentally you're calling on some pretty fundamental changes in that. So you talk a lot about networked ministry, and I'm wondering if you could explain that concept to our audience who's listening.
Sure. In the book, I draw on the work of Margaret Wheatley in her book, Leadership is the New Science, where she sort of says in science, we've sort of understood our world as kind of an engine that runs. And if you take apart the different pieces, you can understand it. Whereas just, scientifically, we understand our world through quantum theory to operate in a different way. And in some ways, in a kind of a networked way, that it's about the relationships. When things come into relationship with one another, they affect each other. And we really see that in this kind of networked way of social media. So we don't live in just these discrete boxes or buildings anymore, that we're crossing over and through a lot of the boundaries that were in place. I mean, a lot of those, if you think about church, is just being very geographic with your location, your parish. And now, using media to be able to reach people around the country or around the world.
I was going to say, just thinking about what you just said, there were members in our class, and I'm sure some of them are listening to this forum, who are from Illinois and Kansas and Maryland and Texas. And there are folks who each found their way to St. Bart's for a very particular reason. But it's no longer that model, let's say, in the Episcopal tradition or our sisters and brothers in the Roman Catholic tradition, where there's that geographical parish anymore. Right. That certain going to the church that's nearest you, that's gone now.
Right, like in Philly, in the city, people who are Catholic, and even people who are Protestant in the city, all the neighborhoods were defined by their parishes. So it wasn't exactly like the neighborhood you lived in, it was the parish you lived in. That's how you identified the part of the city that you lived in. And the same in a broader sense could be true in terms of the people that belong to our church live within a certain geographic area. But now we have Zoom, we've had Zoom worship, and now we're doing a new live stream kind of setup. But we have former members who retired to North Carolina or moved to North Carolina worship with us every Sunday. We have extended family members, friends of family who are worshiping with us. And so that's why I use that, that image of the cathedral, because it's so much more expansive, right? It's sort of more inclusive, so that it's not just the people here, but it's anybody that is connected to us online.
Well, maybe you could say more about why you chose the cathedral in particular. You have all these great vignettes in the book about Washington National Cathedral and St. John the Divine here in New York, and then Canterbury, which apparently has a rivalry with Durham on Twitter. But
yes.
what's so cool about cathedrals?
I've always loved cathedrals, and the idea came. Elizabeth Drescher and I were giving a presentation at Duke for the Lilly Endowment at their website consultation. And we were kind of trying to articulate a way in which the way that we are living our lives and the way that we are church is just more expansive and wider, in that kind of networked way that connects us with so many more people inside and outside the church. And we're literally looking at PowerPoint slides, trying to kind of crystallize this. And when she raised this story or this image from Canterbury Cathedral about how the cathedral was such an integrated part of the town, and then doing more research on that and seeing the ways in which it was just the cathedral's intimately connected. But I think I've always just also had a love and fascination with cathedrals. I mean, I love the Gothic style. I love walking into St. John the Divine or National Cathedral, or I talk about being at St. Pat's in the book as well. And just being bright and open. And I just love to see the tourists and all the people there who are there for so many different reasons. Like I spent almost a whole day at St. John the Divine, and I did some tours. I sat in the chapel and had noontime worship, and every kind of person was in that space, whether it was just architecture or art or curiosity, or it's on the tourist map, or for real religious devotion. Was like, that's the kind of church I'd like to be a part of, where you had all of these people in that same space, and the conversations and the foment that could kind of happen there, the community that could form, is really appealing to me. So I've kind of always had a love of cathedrals, and it just became the way to articulate this idea.
Well, and it's interesting. You say this in the book, but I started off as a historian of the Reformation and the Middle Ages, and what you say has been true for 700, 800 years. You use Canterbury as an example, but so many of these great cathedrals in Western Europe, but not just in Western Europe, were pilgrimage destinations, and so markets sprung up, and all sorts of industries. Both sort of for the common good, and maybe some not so much for the common good, sprung up around these cathedrals.
That's right.
And what's interesting is maybe this pushes your argument in the book a bit far, but cathedrals therefore become a kind of voluntary religious exercise. Like, you're supposed to go to your parish church, but you're choosing to go on pilgrimage to a cathedral. And by that argument, in the world of Zoom, you can go on pilgrimage anywhere. You can literally choose where you want to go. And so on the one hand, that brings so many opportunities for us to reach out as a congregation here at St. Bart's and elsewhere to bring people in. But it's also really daunting because no one has to come to St. Bart's. So what do you say makes a congregation or a religious community be the kind of place that people want to go on pilgrimage to?
Yeah. Our church, I will say that I do think I like that idea, that kind of voluntariness, because I think a lot of people, when they think about going into churches, it kind of comes with a lot of baggage.
Yeah.
And, the ways we think about membership can be pretty limited, even within the church, itself. So I guess I tend to talk about belonging more than membership, that, if you're here, you belong. If you walked in on a Sunday morning for the first time, if you're attending the live stream, you're part of us, you belong. When I think about why people would want to be part of our congregation, just say, we really enjoy each other. We have a lot of fun. We're not stuffy. We're really relatable. And that embodies, before I got here, a lot of the qualities that I, kind of write about: networked and relational and incarnational. And this church has a really huge heart for service in our community and in the city. So, those are the kinds of things that people come to us to explore. But of course, they're looking on our website first at all of those things before they come in the doors.
Well, and it's interesting that the website, the homepage, the Twitter account, whatever it might be, becomes the thing that you look at before you decide whether to undertake that pilgrimage.
Oh, yeah.
And and of course, we all do this. I can't imagine these days choosing a restaurant to go to and not looking at their website.
No. Right.
And that is not a model that any of us who are trained in religion or theology were trained to think about as the default, but it actually is the default experience of the people who are deciding whether to belong or whether to visit or anything like that.
The first thing we did when we went into quarantine was redid our website because we just thought, we need a better platform to host all these things that we're suddenly having to do. So we jumped in and knocked that out, and really grateful now that we did it. We've got this nice platform we can put adult ed resources, confirmation resources, worship resources on.
Was it about reorganizing the site? Was it adding more visuals? What did you all do to it?
We moved from a pretty archaic platform to a Squarespace. So a fairly drag and drop platform that can have multiple editors. And that's just more visually appealing, and it's easier to incorporate media into it. It's just paste your YouTube link, and it's really rich on imagery. So it's much easier to manage, and which is great for me because I wound up being the person to manage the website, and I can share the load. And I think it comes off looking really more modern than the last.
That's fascinating. One of the things, Keith, that you're saying that really resonates with me. So in the higher ed space, we've all been adjusting to teaching on Zoom, and in all of my classes this semester at Fordham, I have live students and Zoom students simultaneously, and we're all learning to be in this new space with each other. And one of the things that our educational design people at Fordham said at the very beginning of the semester is consider having more video than text communication with students. And there's a part of me that was thinking, I would not want to sit and watch me for 5 minutes. I don't want to sit and watch me for 30 seconds, but I would rather read an email than sit for 5 minutes. And it turns out that, of course, our educational design people were exactly right, that there's something about watching, that it brings an element of relationality into the conversation, and people can hear your tone of voice, and they can see your body language, and all of that is different. And so hearing about your website, I'm struck by the way in which this reliance on images and video as opposed to text. It's not a very Protestant thing to do, is it?
No, it's really against the grain. And even with myself, I have to push against it, though I've kind of grown as well. So yeah, we tend to be a very wordy tradition, and Lutherans, chief among us. And just as I write about in the book, we're communicating in images, and the church is always, with stained glass and architecture and all kinds of ways, has used images to communicate. But it's all the more important now. So yeah, our site is filled with different types of YouTube series, whether it's members reflecting on being a part of the church or worship or adult ed programs like you're doing here that we've run that are then kind of create an online library. What we realized with our website was all about explaining what happens once you come to our church, and realizing that if people can't come to the church, then what are we trying to say and what could we provide? And so we're kind of foregrounding a lot of materials that people could use and access from home. Early in the quarantine, I did a Facebook Live. It was a series, but it didn't feel like a series. I was just trying to do something every day for the first days when we were really in lockdown. And I just picked a different book off the shelf and talked about it for a little bit. And that really resonated for people. Just a little check-in, just to hear my voice again. I don't like hearing my own voice. I don't like seeing myself on video, but it definitely is is an effective communication tool. And that's the kind of thing we're doing for confirmation too. A little 5-minute intro video. Here are some things to explore. What do you think?
Well, and it's been one of the most effective sets of things that we've done here at St. Bart's. So to honor one of Peter's clergy colleagues, Deborah Lee, who's put together these daily morning reflections. Our choir has put up videos that they've synced together. Peter's had night prayer and so on and so forth. And so there've been all of these ways that St. Bart's has adopted new practices too, just like you all have. And as I mentioned, one of the things that's happened is we've drawn in this audience from farther afield. And this is a question that came up from one of the folks who was in our class over the summer. And he wanted to make sure that I asked you about techniques for integrating these kinds of farther flung folks into the congregation, either in the short term or maybe even in the long term. We don't want to be intrusive. We don't want this to be an altar call or necessarily ask them for a contribution, although of course that's always going to be coming. But really about how to bring folks together who don't share that sort of common geographical in-person experience. What would you say about that?
That's a great question. I would say a lot of the people that we interact with that are with us in worship that wouldn't normally be here are people that we have some kind of relationship up with already, family or friends or former members who now are still current members, I suppose, but have moved away.
Sure.
We have a whole North Carolina contingent on Sunday mornings. I think creating, I guess I would say I could see how maybe if you're offering like an online Compline that appeals to a certain set of folks who might not be into the Sunday morning experience, but creating some opportunities for some crossover. And I haven't done this, so I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but
please.
Creating opportunities for crossover. Maybe a good example of this is Society of St. John the Evangelist, that I write about and you're familiar with, that this monastery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, this small monastery where I used to love to go to Compline and on retreat. And they have a huge, wide network of people who are connected to them, who support them, who donate to them, who feel a heart connection to the brothers and the ministry. And they may never walk into the monastery, but they're very devoted to the monastery. So I think that's probably and there is that opportunity to become part of this. There's a Fellowship of St. John. I think, the Fellowship of St. John, which I tried to do and then didn't follow through. But creating some avenues, maybe like that, for people to be part of the ministry and the mission. Maybe we need to rethink what our new member classes look like, or who's invited to those new member classes. My friend Jim Keat, who you may know, who was at Middle Collegiate and then at Riverside for a time, was doing sermon talkback Google Hangouts. So for people who couldn't be there to talk about the sermon or talk about worship after church, he hosted this Google Hangout so that people, and sometimes they were members who just weren't in the city or they were further afield, could kind of call in and have a little back and forth with one of the ministers at the church.
Well, and it seems like one of the things that really connects folks is this sense of dialogical, like being in dialogue and being in relationship with each other. And one of the points that you make in the book, I think really, really well, is that sort of social media 2.0, the web 2.0, is this bi-directional, multi-directional environment. It's not just like old broadcast media where there are elite producers of content, like those who give sermons, and then the rest of us who listen to them. And so one of the challenges becomes, in a religious tradition that for literally hundreds of years has relied on this notion of communication by some to others, how to really reinvent that around the language of relationships and dialogue and so on and so forth. And I have to say, you go ahead, please.
Oh no, and then you kind of realize when you don't have it, on the Sunday morning experience, I'm preaching to a laptop or I'm preaching to a camera, you realize that once the service is over and you're standing at the door, that's when that dialogue begins. That the back door of the church, through coffee hour, through the week, as people are coming through the building and the door about worship or about the sermon, about the text, whatever it is, that whole conversation happens naturally in person in a church. And it's now only in its absence that I really can have a different perspective on that. And then the question is, how do we engage people around that digitally? How do you have a conversation either before the sermon? I used to do a little 2-minute Bible study on YouTube to get people thinking and talking in advance, or after the sermon, during the week.
So Keith, this is where I have to admit, and the members of our class would criticize me rightly if I didn't. This was the place where some of us weren't able to follow you, or felt a little bit less comfortable following you. And the argument that these folks made, and I want to make it as best as they would, is I go to the medical doctor because that person is trained in medicine. And I go talk to my lawyer because that person's trained in law. And I don't want to have a conversation with my lawyer. I just want to find out how I need to do my thing. And I want to talk to my medical doctor about how I can get well. So what's up with this whole dialogical model? I mean, isn't that kind of why there are people like you who are experts in this field who can help us do the work that we need to do spiritually?
Well, I think the role of ministry is a little different than some of those. I still have dialogues with my lawyers and doctors, but the point is well taken. But I think the role of a pastor, at least for me, is a combination of the two of those. I'm definitely responsible for the theology and preaching and teaching, and I'm the resident expert in theology here at the church. Sure. But theology is, I write in the book, is also a conversation. I think maybe what I was pushing against was too much. We're on the pastor's the expert side, or the experts are the experts, or the professors are the experts, and we, as opposed to engaging both sides of that equation. So that's what I do every week. It's part of my role, but it would be really not satisfying to me if there wasn't this back and forth and conversation and elevating, sort of the expertise of people in the room when we have our theology pubs, our God on Tap, and my just really starting kind of facilitating that conversation. There's so much wisdom, the wisdom of the group, the wisdom of the crowd. There really is so much wisdom and richness. And I think a lot of times in churches, people feel like they can't share it because they feel like they have to have the right answer, or they're not the expert.
Yeah, and I think that so often the conversations around who is allowed to have experience that's relevant here. And all of us in our lives have experience of what the mystery of God means for us. And obviously there are some, and I'm certainly not one of them, who have expertise in translating that pastorally. But one of the things I see you lifting up in the book is something that I say a lot to my undergraduates at Fordham, which is, if we think about these traditional sources of theology, whether they be scripture or tradition, one of them is human experience. And in an incarnational faith, part of that commitment is that we all encounter God through our bodies, through our daily lives, through all of these different things. And no one is more of an expert about that for us than each of us. And so I thought that those points resonated really, really well. But just to stay with the devil's advocate for a second, I guess the question I want to ask you is, what is church for in 2020? And what I mean by that is you say in the book that there are these sort of traditional models of saving people's souls, evangelizing, preaching the gospel to the unconverted. And I'm maybe being a little bit hyperbolic here, but there is a certain model where the task of the church is to go out and convert the world, whether the world likes it or not. And that may not be the world of 2020 anymore. And so what's church for?
I mean, for me, it's, worshiping God in that we are keeping God at the center of who we are, of our community and our lives. And I think church is for the healing of the world, and which is a way to say not necessarily to convert it, but to meet it with the love and grace and mercy that we know through God, and to bring that compassion and understanding and help to our neighbors. And in that case, I let the chips fall where they may. So that's my calling. And if it turns out that, I get to do somebody's wedding, or somebody joins our church, or somebody just knows on a day they're not alone, and that's enough, then that's enough. So that's kind of where I come from on that.
There's a real beautiful sort of open-handedness about what you're talking about. And what I also hear in what you're talking about is this call for the church to go outside itself. Peter knows that I've spent some time over the last couple of years doing a lot of commentary about the current Pope. And I think within the Roman Catholic world, he has been exceedingly clear on the need for the church to go outside of itself. And it was interesting when we had our discussion group around your book, one of the questions and one of the stories that kept coming up is that a former rector of St. Bart's, back I think in the early 1990s, some of those who are listening will know the story and will correct me if I'm wrong. It was a time when St. Bart's was really struggling in terms of membership. And so the rector set up a lemonade stand on Park Avenue, just on the other side of the street. And there was a sign there that said something like, ask me about the weather, or something along those lines. And he was just sitting there, giving out his lemonade. And many, many more people felt comfortable coming up to him. He had his clerical collar on, apparently. But it was to go up to St. Bart's, you literally have to walk up like 12 stairs to get to the main part of the church, which is one floor up. And it's a big, beautiful building, but it's also a really imposing building on Park Avenue next to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. So what are the mindset shifts that you think that churches and congregations need to undertake? You talk a lot in the book about going into so-called third places, and I think people might want to hear about that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think I love that story. That's a great example. And yeah, what I write about in the book is just putting yourself in the places where people are and where people are gathering, and making yourself available. Because when you work in the church every day, you don't really appreciate the barriers that it can present to be on a church property, to be in a church building, to approach a pastor, depending on what people's experiences have been. So being at a coffee shop, I've hosted theology pubs. A lot of people do coffee shop office hours. A lot of people do, and in different places, and being present. And we're a really foodie town that we live in Ambler. We have a ton of great restaurants, which are having a hard time at the moment with COVID. But knowing the owners, knowing the restaurants, just to be there at a dinner and with friends, and the owner, the owner, and it comes over to you, and we chat for a little bit. And I think those things are just to be known in the community. I think are important. Or the general manager of the new co-op grocery store, down the road, just to be known, to be available. And sometimes I wear a collar. A lot of times I don't. Sometimes I'm there by myself. Sometimes I'm there with other people. But it definitely creates a way in. And I have a friend. She's a pastor up in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and she refers to it as being the God person in people's lives. And that's what she gets to be. She's really great at community ministry, and that's how I get to feel like I get to be the God person in people's lives when a lot of people don't have that person. So when they have a question or when they're getting married, or, I'm get to be the person they approach about it, which is a real joy.
Well, and it sounds like this notion of approachability is central to what we're talking about here. And I often joke with my students that there's this whole church vocabulary where a lectern isn't a lectern, it's an ambo. And a cape isn't a cape, it's a cope. And there's all of these special in-group words that we have
right.
that can be off-putting if folks feel like they have to learn this whole other language or buy into a whole way of being, when in fact we're talking about really fundamentally relationship, right?
Right. I mean, that's where does faith happen the most during the week? In people's homes and gathering spaces, at their work, right? Church for me is an everyday. For them, it's maybe a once a week or a couple times a week. It's very important, but early on, and I think maybe I was a pastoral intern, and I remember preaching these sermons that were way too, theological. And I really didn't know what I was talking about. And people were just like, where does the rubber hit the road? Where does it touch the ground? Where does it touch people's lives? And that really made such an impact on me. And it's like, where does it touch my life? Where do I see God in my daily life? And how can I share those stories, but also evoke other people's stories, or that they can identify, no place is too mundane, too small, too out of the way to find God there. God's in all these places. So I think it's an invitation for people to find God in their daily lives as well. And if their pastor shows up at the pub that they go to, or the coffee shop where they like to go, it's just a little reminder that God's there too.
Well, and that just draws together so many different aspects of what you say in the book. So you talk about the sacrament of doing the dishes, for instance. Right. And I think about Pope Francis talking about pastors having the so-called smell of the sheep, although I don't love the sheep image, but I think I get what he's aiming for. Yeah. One of the other themes that came up as we're sort of moving toward the end of this conversation. So I'm a member of the vestry here at St. Bart's, very, very proud. We've got a great vestry. We've got 2 wonderful lay wardens. And some of my fellow vestry members came to these classes from time to time, and they often said, and I feel some of this too, there's all of this enthusiasm for the ideas that you've brought forward, but we also have duties to a place like St. Bart's as an institution, and the roof needs to be fixed, and people need to be paid, and all of the sort of mundane, ordinary tasks of keeping a 100-plus-year-old institution going. So I guess what I would want to ask is, like, how do we balance these real and creative and important opportunities for ministry with sort of the weight of our institutional responsibilities? Yeah,
that's a great question. We've so the church I am pastoring now, it's been around since 1752. Wow. On the same property, but not the same building. We're on the third, fourth, fifth building. And so we've been around a long time, and there's a great sense of responsibility to steward this church into the future. And so we do have to make sure that we're operating well, that the fundamentals of operating a church, a nonprofit, a building, that we do those well as the platform from which we can do our ministries, both the traditional historic ministries that we've done, but also then extending, those ministries out. I mean, one of the things I like about the ideas that I talk about is they're not very expensive. They're a lot about putting yourself. So in terms of my time and the value or expense of my time, that is certainly an investment. But a lot of them are not expensive. It's a lot more about, I think, time and attention. And intention about where those are. So yeah, we need both of those. And the question I have then is, as we've conceived of the structures of our church, or the methodologies of membership or giving, and how we've conceived of those, as our financial model is built on you come and you visit and you join and you pledge, and that's how we sustain ourselves, and that is who our community is, and that's how we support it. Are there can we be more expansive, not dropping that, but can we be more expansive about it's that, and it can also be this alongside of that. And I don't, that's a big question. And I don't, we're living into the reality of what that could look like. And I don't have the answer, but for me, it's definitely not an either or. It's definitely a both and, especially kind of as we're making our way through this time.
Well, it's so wise to think about these sort of alternate tracks. Like the story that you just told is the standard story, right? That you join and then you move up the giving ladder and all of those kinds of things.
Right. And the example of St. John the Evangelist is that they have this broad group of people that they've connected with very intentionally and resourced through the resources of the church that are connected to them and that help to support them. So I couldn't do anything on that scale, but on some smaller scale, could we?
Yeah, I think that's right. And we have to all be very, very creative going forward. And I guess that brings me back to where we started. So what I want to leave you with is this last question, which is about predicting the future, which I know is always very tough. In the last month, I've seen some surveys that suggest that the decline in mainline church attendance is beginning to bottom out, that there's, we sort of found a floor, maybe not. But I've also seen some studies that sadly suggesting that 25 to 30% of mainline congregations won't be able to make it through COVID financially. And those are really serious realities in every denomination. And so I would love for you to put on your magic hat and look in your crystal ball and, 5 years from now, what will the congregations that have managed this time best, what will they have done?
Great question. I think they'll have been very financially responsible, but I don't think they will have gone into hiding or covered up or gone into hibernation just waiting for it to pass. And I wouldn't say like we're at this, I think we've done some really good financial things this year, but I mean, I wouldn't say like that we're now in the totally looking forward moment, but that moment is coming when we're saying, how can we take what we've learned and how can we move forward? We're coming into stewardship time, and our stewardship for pledging for next year is all about looking ahead and looking forward. And how can we kind of step out of this eternal present that I'm calling it of COVID, where time has no meaning and we just feel kind of stuck in place and it goes fast and slow at the same time, and really look ahead. So while we have to manage what's happening right now with the reality, we also still need to be dreaming and anticipating what could happen. I think COVID, like so many things, has exposed a lot of things in our culture. It's also accelerated a lot of changes in our culture. And I was talking to somebody earlier today that, I don't know that COVID's changed the narrative for the mainline church, but it's accelerated the narrative for the mainline church. And I think that's probably more the reality. So the things that I thought might take years to take place in the Digital Cathedral, we're now 6 months in, and a lot of those things are happening, both in terms of the good of stepping up and stepping into these digital spaces and seeing what it can mean, but also the challenges that a lot of these trends for the mainline, that we're facing, the challenges that we're facing.
Well, and that's certainly, go ahead. Sorry.
No, and I think that we have a region where we have a lot of smaller congregations, and it was probably a matter of time for a lot of those congregations. This is moving that forward. But sure. What are the ways that in which like congregations like mine, who do have resources and have a long history and are in good shape, how can we then look at those, our neighborhoods, those areas around us, the areas that have been served so faithfully by those churches, and help to support the ministries that could happen in those areas. So I think that's also a question, is how can we expand our sense of not just digitally, but maybe geographically, to support ministry happening in these areas where it no longer does.
Keith, thank you so much for all of your insights today. I have so enjoyed this conversation. Among other things, I've learned that Zoom is an eternal present, and that explains so much of the last 6 months to me. I used to judge where I was, you could remember like where you used to sit in different rooms, and now I sit in the same place every day. But truly, on behalf of all of us at St. Bart's, thanks for sharing your wisdom with us. Thanks for writing this book, and let me hand the floor back over to Peter.
Thank you both so much, Keith and Patrick, for considering the present moment and where we're headed in this conversation. Thank you to all of you for watching. Please join us for worship at 11 a.m.